I've long believed, I mean, really part of the reason why we started this podcast is that there's a good, a bad, and an ugly to American history.
Of course.
And our job is not to agree with it all or
No.
to love it all, but somehow we need to hold it all within ourselves and find some kind of reconciliation and acceptance of it. Look where we're at right now. And this is essentially what we've been talking about for the past half hour. But, you know, we think about the Civil War, the incredible documentary you made about the Civil War and what's happening now with monuments and the ideas of how to think about the Confederacy and how to think about the war itself. And of course, we see it in every aspect of our culture and our lives. How should we look to these uglier moments in American history with understanding and acceptance? How can we do that?
It's the human, we have to do that. We have no choice. If you think we have labored for too long in our schools and elsewhere with a kind of sanitized Madison Avenue view of American history. And it's just not that. But you then don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The exceptionalism, which we almost singularly claim for ourselves, doesn't look so great these days, but it's had lots of problems in various times. And sometimes it's the recognition of that. We were speaking about it before we started, is that the pursuit of happiness is like a red herring, right? When Thomas Jefferson wrote it, and it was agreed that the pursuit of happiness, meaning you don't get it, you try for it, right? It's always an objective that you have. And happiness was not the acquisition of objects in a marketplace of things. It was lifelong learning in a marketplace of ideas. That's what the founders meant by happiness. But we've kind of polluted, well, I deserve to be happy. You know, we have two kinds of freedom, right? My freedom, what I want, and the collective freedom, what we need. You know, we have laws, right? You can't drive on the left side of the road, right? You got to drive on the right side of the road. You've got to register that car. You've got to do all sorts of little things in which we all willingly submit, but find out some other area and nobody wants to do anything. This is impinging on my freedom. So we've had great tensions over all of that. And we've tended to ignore, it is very human to do this. It isn't just American. We have tended to ignore the things, the violence that takes place. That is part of our nature. The wars almost immediately become sentimentalized with treacly stuff, and we forget the extraordinary cost. You know, only mothers really remember what the cost of war is, and it becomes incumbent upon us, as we have done in the Civil War or World War II in a film that came out in 2007 called The War, or in Vietnam War that came out in 2017. We're now working on the American Revolution to don't soft pedal it. You know, the Civil War wasn't a civil war. It was a sectional war, right? With the exception of Missouri and parts of Kansas, there's not a lot of civilian deaths, which is what happens in civil wars. It's a sectional war. This group believes this group doesn't believe this, we're leaving, no, you're not. This is the Civil War. The siege of Atlanta killed less than 20 civilians. The civilian casualties in the greatest battle in the Western Hemisphere, if you just limit it to the land mass of North America and South America, is Gettysburg, and there are 2 civilian deaths. 2, right? But the American Revolution, now that's a civil war. We always say brother against brother, you know, maybe. But in the Revolution, Benjamin Franklin's son, William, was the royal governor of New Jersey, was deposed, continued to work against the independence, was put in jail, was released, presumed that he would go to England, stayed, started a terrorist organization that killed what we would call patriots, and tried to reconcile afterwards with his dad, who said NFW, right? And it's pretty shocking on both the son's part and the father's part. And it makes for a great story. But I think it goes back to the fact that we need to be able to have a complicated picture. We need to also be able to grow, so that the whole manifestation of this monument stuff, I'm happy to grow. I'm happy to understand those monuments got put up, most of them, in the period after the collapse of Reconstruction. They were part of the expression, the billboards of the reimposition of white supremacy, of Jim Crow, of lynching as a legitimate expression of justice, of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. The flag, the Confederate flag, was not the Confederate flag. It is a battle flag of the Army of the Northern Virginia, which was adopted by the Ku Klux Klan, one of many. It is not the official flag of the Confederacy. That's a different flag. It went into the state flags of all the Confederacies. It's come out now of all of them, including, finally, thank God, Mississippi, which was the oldest. But when you look about when it went in there, it was, the statues went up either in that post-Reconstruction period or in reaction to Brown versus Board of Education, right? A lot of those Dixie, the Confederate battle flag that went into the state flags of the southern states came in after 1954. And the only thing that happened in 1954 is the Supreme Court said that separate but equal isn't right, as Plessy versus Ferguson in 1898 said it was. So you've got, you know what? And people say they're taking away my history. It's not. You're actually pulling the lens back, and you're having a much more inclusive history. And how can you take South Carolina, where the majority of citizens were African Americans, right?
Mississippi.
The Mississippi, the same thing. I mean, how are we suddenly, if we're the land of the free and we have 4 million people owned by other people, oops, this is February. This is Black History Month, and it's the shortest and the coldest month. Black history is every single day, because if you start a country and the guy who articulates our creed, distilling a century of Enlightenment thinking into one sentence that begins, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and he owns more than 200 human beings, oops. He doesn't see the contradiction. He doesn't see the hypocrisy. And more importantly, he doesn't see fit to free any of those people in his lifetime. And he sets in motion an American narrative that is a priori forced, as it had been since 1619, to deal with it. But let's deal with it. I mean, right now we have 3 viruses going on, right? 3 viruses. One is this year-plus-old COVID-19 virus. Devastating. Once in a century thing. We also have a 402-year-old virus of white supremacy, of racial injustice, of racism, of hatred, based because it's easier to find evil in the other and to judge people based, as Dr. King said, on the color of their skin, not the content of their character. Now I've flipped his statement. And then we've got an age-old human virus that's around us, which is the virus of lying, of misinformation, of conspiracy, of paranoia. This is not American. This is everybody. And when those 3 viruses come together the way we are now, it is a recipe for disaster. And the only thing that sets us free is A, being honest about it, and B, telling us that none of these things are without some kind of precedent, even though the times are unprecedented. And that's our job. Your job and my job is just to tell a very complex and important history that delivers us to this moment. And you go, well, if history doesn't repeat itself, if we're not condemned to repeat what we don't remember, what is it about? So you go back to Ecclesiastes, right? That's the Old Testament. And it says, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun, which means that human nature doesn't change, and that it superimposes itself over the seemingly random chaos of events. And so we see patterns, we see motifs, we see recurrences of behaviors. We hear the rhymes, and that's what we're obligated to talk about. And nothing's off the table. Nothing's off the table.
You point out this what I think is beautiful, the way you said it. This idea that it's the pursuit of happiness, and it's not the guarantee of happiness.
No.
And when you perceive it like that, though, if you read it as the guarantee of happiness, then any suffering is therefore is you being denied something that you think you owe. But suffering is something that's universal.
Suffering's
And
universal, and none of us are getting out of this alive. So there's the ultimate approaching suffering that people like Hemingway are going to try to deal with or not deal with, as the case may be. And our lives are more defined by the troubles that we've had. My mother died when I was 11 years old of cancer after a many-year illness. I would not be here if she had not died. I spent my entire professional life, as my late father-in-law, a psychologist, said, waking the dead. He said, you make Abraham Lincoln and Jackie Robinson come alive. Who do you think you're really trying to wake up? Now, that may be dime store psychology. It's simplified, but it has been, that has been the motivating aspect of my life. There's never been a day since April 28th, 1965, when my mother died, that I haven't thought about her and thought about the thing and missed her, missed her. And so it's all there. It's that's who we are.